Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the all-good, the infinitely compassionate and merciful. I could not begin a discourse based on Abraham without citing the name of God, the God of Abraham, who is shared not only by Jews, Muslims and Christians, but also, of course, by all those created by God, although known under other names. Much of what I will say to you today stands against everything that you read in newspapers and the general public discourse on the relationship between religion and science, and much of it will appear as iconoclastic. But I speak as someone who knows a little bit about science, who has 2 science degrees from MIT and Harvard, and who spent a lifetime in the relationship between religion and science. It's not simply sloganeering, but it's the fruit of many decades of the study of this subject from the point of view of not only the West, but also of other civilizations and schools of thought, and especially my own tradition, the Islamic. In the West, for the past 400 years, religion has been on the retreat, whereas science has taken steps one after another to claim realms which belonged to religion beforehand. Most important, of course, being the cosmos itself, which after the tragedies of the Galileo trial, the Catholic Church gave up, no longer dealing seriously with a theology of nature, with a theology which would have a scientific, in the sense of dealing with scientific study of nature, component to it. And Protestantism came upon the scene exactly at that time and developed a kind of acosmic theology, not very much concerned with the world of nature. And so the world that surrounds us, which in a sense determines much of our perspective upon reality, was surrendered to a very particular form of science, not just any science. A science which was based on the negation of the qualitative aspects of nature and tried to quantify nature completely, also based on the complete bifurcation, that is division, between the knowing subject and the known object, that is Cartesian dualism, upon which even quantum mechanics still operates. It's trying to free itself from that somewhat, but we still think that there's mysteriously the subject that knows, a la Descartes, and there's the world out there that is known, and how we know that, we really do not know, but half the troop is on the side of materialism, the other half of idealism, but always caught actually at the throes of this dualism. So it was not just any science to which Christianity surrendered God's creation to. It was a science which in its own scientific activity did not pay any attention to any level of reality beyond the res extensa of Descartes, that is pure quantity, the quantitative measurable world. And on the human side, considered only those aspects of the mind which deal with measurement and observation and calculation and rational and logical manipulations of concepts to be really serious. The rest was relegated to subjectivism. The consequence of that for our world has been immense. We are on the verge of destroying the world of nature and ourselves. We now try to manipulate without any greater wisdom even the workings of the biological units which comprise the world of living things, and including ourselves. We don't know where we come from, we do not know where we're going, we're dominated by greed in the utmost degree, but we're now having the science penetrate into the very structure of the body of human beings. And so we're facing really a crisis of immense proportions. And just to talk in a kind of sweet, sentimental way about the harmony between religion and science is daydreaming of the worst kind. We have to, I believe, wake up. Science is very legitimate and very important, provided it does not claim to be what it is not, and is not turned into a worldview which ends with the Time magazine predicting the end of the universe. I mean, what hubris, what stupidity. One bip out of outer space will change all of that view. Every few years you have some kind of a theory, and then goes away and some other theory comes in, and on the cover of the most important weekly magazine of the United States is determined completely what the end of the universe will be. It's this kind of hubris that is going to kill us all if we don't wake up. And that is why this issue of the relationship between religion and science and how they envisage the nature of man and the nature of God are so important. Lest you think that what I say is the view of a theologian or philosopher or mystic from some wild person from the East born in Persia, I want to quote here for you, the only quotation I will make today, the words of the doyen of the French biologist of a few years ago, and an avowed atheist, a hater of the divinity and of all that is sacred, and a complete materialist, Jacques Monod. Jacques Monod writes, "No society before ours was ever rent by contradictions so agonizing. In both primitive and classical cultures, the religious traditions saw knowledge and values stemming from the same source." He uses the word animistic, but by that he means religious. "For the first time in history, a civilization is trying to shape itself while clinging desperately to the religious animistic tradition, to the same time abandoning it as the source of knowledge. Just as the initial choice in the biological evolution of a species can be binding upon its entire future, so the choice of scientific practice, and an unconscious choice in the beginning, has launched the evolution of culture on a one-way path," of course it means modern Western culture, "onto a track which 19th century scientism saw leading infallibly upward to an Empyrean noon hour for mankind. Whereas what we see opening before us today is an abyss of darkness. If we're going to be realist, if we're going to really see the situation we're in, we have to realize that we are facing an abyss of darkness if we do not re-examine what the claims of this scientific worldview, this way of reducing the world to its least common denominator, means for us as human beings in our relationship with God, in the understanding of God, and our relationship with ourselves and the rest of creation. So first of all, the answer to the question, what can science teach us about God and man, or human beings, and the use of man in this lecture, by that I mean the homo vir of Latin and Greek, or mentioned German and not male. What we mean by that, my first answer would be nothing. What can science teach us about God and man? I would say nothing. And this would shock you probably out of your clothing. Because we always expect every answer to come from the scientists. Whenever we want to buy a product, on television in the Middle Ages, it was the person wearing dark black who carried the truth, the priest. Today it's the man with a white coat. As soon as he comes, he will sell you something because the doctor or is a scientist, and anything a scientist says is supposed to be the ex cathedra final truth statement about anything. So to say that nothing is a shocking thing, but I would add to that also something. I want to examine these two a little bit. First of all, there's no use talking about what science can teach us unless we understand what science is. And although science is now the predominant, in a sense, pseudo-religion of the modern world, and especially in Europe, it has led, for the first time in human history, to a society whose majority are agnostics or atheists. Don't forget that Europe is the only continent that produced atheists until it spread into other continents. Atheism into communism is a recent phenomenon, and Karl Marx was not a Chinese philosopher. So what I'm saying is not negated by the fact that you do have now Chinese and Japanese atheists around, but before European civilization spilled onto the West, onto other continents, it was the first part of the world which produced atheists. This is a statement that makes shocking to everyone, but unfortunately it's true. The only other exception was the late antiquity, again in Europe, when the Roman Empire was dying. The Greco-Roman civilization was dying, and it produced a few atheists before it died out. But the rest of the world, including the rest of Europe and America and Asia and so forth and so on, they have lived by and large in the world of faith. Most human beings have believed. But where the scientific revolution was born is a place were also the denial of God, the secularist point of view, the negation of anything above and beyond the measurable, quantifiable, experiential or experimental views presented in modern Western science took hold. Now, we therefore have to understand this science. We cannot make a mistake between the founders or practitioners of the science and the science itself. That's one of the great mistakes that people make. Among the founding giants of modern science, Newton and Kepler were very pious and devout people. Descartes was comme ci comme ça, and Galileo was a maverick. But the majority was still with believers. Even Galileo could not imagine not believing in God at all. He just wanted to play the role of God a little bit himself. But Descartes, you know, was a very pious Catholic. He didn't miss one mass all of his life, although his philosophy was anti-Christian. It cut off the hands of God from the immediacy of human existence. But nevertheless, himself was a pious Catholic. And later times, you can oftentimes see scientists who are personally either very devout, or even if they're atheists, they're very moralistic and very ethical in their attitude. Not only moralistic, but moral and very ethical in their attitude. I know when I was studying at MIT, great physicists who wouldn't put their foot on an ant if they walked in Cambridge, but who had also made the atomic bomb which had killed 200,000 people 2 years before, so a few years before. So personally, there are a lot of people who are extremely ethical. It's the question of the science itself that we are discussing. The science which has been able to create such remarkably powerful technologies, which has given such power to human beings, was in fact created in order to gain power. As St. Francis Bacon said, science should have for its purpose power over nature. So it's a science based on power. And to dominate, it had to negate all that it could not dominate. That is, all that is above the human world. And gradually this negation came to be taken for fact. That is, what doesn't fit into the vision of my telescope is non-existent. And this gradually came about on the basis of that original quantification and reduction of nature. Now, there are many scientists, I hope there are some scientists here in this audience, who would love to hear the Mozart Symphony No. 25, which is going to be performed here tonight. But that's as an individual, whereas the beauty of sound is an irrelevant statement, scientifically speaking. The only thing that's beautiful in science is the elegance of mathematical formulations. If you let's say solve the Clark-Maxwell equations, electromagnetism has certain elegance. But beauty as we understand it, the beauty of a flower, or the face of my daughter, or the Mozart symphony, these are irrelevant to the scientific worldview. It has nothing to do with it. So beauty is out. Goodness. Goodness. We cannot live without goodness and beauty. Goodness doesn't have any meaning, again, in this particular way of looking at the world, which was the scientific worldview. It didn't mean anything. It was a category which does not mean anything. How you apply it is quite something else. We should never confuse science and technology. Technology you apply according to certain purposes. If the purpose is for the good, it will have good results. If it's for the bad, it will have bad results. But the bad is always winning out because the bad dominates over us. We're still the same imperfect human beings who had lances in our hand, but now we have hydrogen bombs. So the evil is just aggrandized by the power that is put in our hands. As for truth, the third of the major categories which determine human existence, of course, science reduces all truth to scientific truth. And there it's very insistent. But by virtue of that, all other kinds of truths gradually became relativized in Western civilization, to the extent that in religion, in theology, today no one talks about heresy. Because where there is no truth, there is no falsehood. In order not to have any truth, one that, of course, does not have any falsehood. Whereas science has preserved its heresy. If you're a biology professor and do not accept Darwinian theory as anything more than an ideology, you don't get promotion, you're kicked out very soon out of the department. But if you're a theologian, practically anything you say, go in. And then in the humanities, in the field of the humanities, to speak about the truth, you get kicked out of the university immediately. Since I'm a university professor, nobody can kick me out. But if some little professor at George Washington University is talking about the truth in the philosophy department, he doesn't get promoted. I am very ashamed because I'm a Harvard graduate. And you enter the doors, gates of Harvard University, says veritas in Latin, the truth. The only thing which is not taught in that university is the truth. Except in the chemistry department or something like that. I accept that. I mean, there is a definition of the content of calcium of a particular salt, and that if you discover that's the truth. But truth in a philosophical, theological, religious, ethical sense is relativized. In this situation, that we then have to apply this extremely powerful form of knowledge, which is science, to our everyday life. So we have a kind of impoverishment of reality, an irrelevance of the transcendent, whether one accepts the transcendent or not personally, that's quite another issue, and then indifference to the question of the good. Now, the dangers of the application of the sciences have become so great that finally in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a couple of decades ago, the Association of Concerned and Responsible Scientists was brought into being, which means all the other scientists are unconcerned and irresponsible, which is very unfortunate. All scientists should have been in that association from the very beginning. I mean, that's really unbelievable. I remember Robert Oppenheimer, just before his death, who made the atomic bomb. His conscience was so much bothered by what he had done. He used to quote from the Upanishads, the sacred scripture of Hinduism on the one hand, and then talk about modern science on the other hand. And one day, in one of his lectures, he said, when we set out the very first reaction, atomic reaction, we were not sure it was not going to go through the whole universe and unravel the universe, but we did it anyway. I mean, can you imagine bearing that on your shoulders until you die? And he died really a broken man because he was a moral being, a moral human being. So we should have all been concerned from the very beginning. And today, one of the very peculiar situations that we have, which is really destroying everything for us, is that you still have this idea that the responsibility of the scientist is not to the good, it's for the politicians, individual human beings, companies, others to apply this. He is just there to discover facts or the truth of something. And secondly, the brokenness of the value system. Having broken the value system, now we have we have to make decisions. And that is why every single major decision that has to be taken, you can always find a few scientists who are not quite sure, and you can make use of them. Let's continue, let's say, to erode the beaches or drill in such a place or drive sport utility vehicles which do a very good job with destroying the ozone zone, because you always find one scientist who will come and say to in the company advertisement that we're not completely sure. So this very question of the destruction of common ethical norm precisely by the presence and the prestige of the science, not by the scientists, has itself made the problems now being created by the application of this science extremely difficult to solve. It's now everywhere. The question, for example, of bioengineering, genetically ordered children, which is now coming to the fore. You want not only your child not to have cancer, but also to be blue-eyed, to get into Harvard and be on the crew team. You know, all of these things, and all of the selfishness, all of the pettiness of human existence is now finding a channel in order to penetrate into the very structure of our bodies, into the future of the human species. So the very ambiguity created by an amoral science, that is science which from the very beginning said, I had nothing to do with the good, has now made this crisis doubly difficult. In this quotation of Jacques Monod, which I just cited for you, he's intelligent enough to realize that in all pre-modern civilizations, the source of knowledge and the source of the good were related. That is, what you knew about God and yourself and the universe was related to the origin of the good. God was good, or made his creation good. He promulgated certain laws, Now this is being completely broken. Completely broken, and we must rebuild that if we're going to survive. That is the knowledge which science offers of the cosmos, which is the only knowledge which modern society accepts as knowledge in a completely certain way. Everything is relegated to the side, including theology and philosophy. Philosophy is remained a handmaid of science, more or less. All of this reduction of knowledge of things, of reality, to the knowledge of science, has created a situation for us in which all of our ethical norms, what still remains of ethical norms, are based on sentimentality, are based on really what we inherited from the religious phases of our history. We all would say one should not commit murder. But why not commit murder from a scientific point of view? Just purely scientific point of view. You always have the mad scientist. From a purely logical and philosophical point of view, I as a philosopher could sit down and prove to you that there is no position except the sentimental position to make a defense of not killing someone if you can get away with it. The reason we have these values is because of what, from the point of religious people, God revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, or what Christ taught, or what the Prophet of Islam taught, what all the religions have taught. But even if we put religion aside, where is going to be our source of ethics? We keep talking about how life is sacred. This is a meaningless statement from the point of view of the modern scientific outlook. This word has no meaning. It has a lot of meaning from a religious point of view. And so we're stuck in what Monod exactly said. On the one hand, we say life is sacred. On the other hand, we do manipulations on life. When does the sacredness start? Why is it if at point A you kill a fetus, whether it's of a human being or of a lamb or of a cow, doesn't make a difference. It's all right. If you do it 8 months later, you go to jail. What has happened during these 8 months that has made a little blob of matter sacred? The scientific view, of course, cannot answer that. It's our sentiments that we carry back. But it is not only sentiments. It really corresponds to the aspect or an aspect of the nature of reality which we've decided to put aside. And that is why I believe if you're going to have a serious relation between religion and science, religion, of course, has to respect science for what it has discovered, but not for what it claims to be and it's not. Many of the claims of science are extrapolations of incredible, far-fetchedness. I just mentioned this question of death of the universe. All of these other things, that's not real science. Real science is chemistry, quantum mechanics, and you observe something, you analyze a particular solution, and pass electric currents through this and measure. That's fine, that's science. Religion must respect that, but must assert and claim that this way of studying the world does not exhaust the nature of the world. Either we're going to be able to rediscover that other knowledge, you might say, of the world of nature, or we're going to die. That's my belief. There's no third way. That's it. Finally, ultimately, that's what's going to happen. No amount of clever engineering, no amount of voting in booths is going to save us in this crisis unless we change our attitude towards the world of nature. And really, if you come down from a purely logical point of view, if you accept the Darwinian hypothesis, which is very problematic logically, philosophically, religiously, and biologically, but you accept it as the ideology, prevalent ideology of the day, that everything in the universe is the banging of the soup of electrons from the very beginning, banging against each other. So what if all the species of the world disappear? It's part of the evolutionary process. If there's nothing else except the evolutionary process, why even talk about it? So logically and rationally, it paralyzes us absolutely. That's why nobody wants to talk in these clear terms on these matters. We zigzag along, we don't want to think clearly about it. But the way out of this is precisely for religion to respect science for what it is, but to also assert that there is, in fact, another way of looking at the world. God's creation is not exhausted by the quantitative aspect of things which physics studies. Physics is the queen of the sciences, and the other sciences try to emulate. And to try to understand itself the nature of the world as had always done various civilizations, and try to understand what science has discovered, which scientists themselves cannot interpret qua scientists. This is very, very important. The book came out on what the scientists think about the nature of God. It was statistics actually taken. Einstein says yes, and Bohr says, I don't know, 3 columns, somebody says no, as if, this will determine whether we believe in God or not. If the majority of scientists say yes, I'll believe in God. If not, I won't. Whereas in fact, some scientists are very great physicists, they're like children when they speak about philosophy and theology. They know very little about it. But it's the aura that is around their head, what they carry with them, which many of them themselves are the very first to admit is not right. Many of the scientists themselves are extremely humble and fine human beings. But it's the situation that carries this with it. It's precisely because of this that religion must be able to hold on to its understanding of the nature of God and man, independent completely of whatever this kind of science says. What do I mean by that? I don't mean interpretations made by us of a particular verse of the Bible, let's say whether God created the world in 6 days or not. Besides, who knows what a day with God is? The first day there was no sun even, how to measure the day. And the Kabbalists, of course, wrote extensively about it before modern times. I do not mean literalist and childish interpretation of sacred scripture. But the vast metaphysical, theological understanding of the nature of God, God is infinite, as absolute, as the supreme good, as the source of all that is beautiful and the good, as our origin, our end, being from which we come and to which we return. All of these things, no matter what these cosmologists say about expansion theory, Big Bang theory, Little Bang theory, strand theory, accordion theory, all of these things that come up and go, they're totally irrelevant, because the very method of seeking, the epistemology is different. What you hear in music and when you touch the violin do not give you the two same kind of knowledge, the two different forms of knowledge. We're not negating that other form of knowledge. But this kind of knowledge cannot be negated. The same is true for the nature of the human being. For millennia, human beings tried to be good because they believed that they descended from the good, from the goodly model. Now, since they believe they've ascended from the ape, why should we be good? I mean, these are questions which have to be answered. Once you don't answer them, then you have chaos in society. The older generation simply inherited from their parents. They didn't have to ask these questions. But now we have to answer these questions. Religion must not submit to that. Once you submit to that we are nothing but the result of those molecules banging against each other for a very long time, then the nature of man, the nature of woman, the nature of the human being, the grandeur of the human soul, not only the emotions, the spiritual elements, the infinite deep fathom of the human soul, all of that becomes a dream, a chimera, a fiction, an unreal thing. And we keep floating on the surface of our being, where we are definable, more and more turning towards the pleasurable, the hedonistic, that which satisfies the external senses. And that itself accelerates the destruction of our world. I mean, if everybody in the world needed as many goods as people in this country, we would not be around anymore. The amount of things that we take from the environment in order to just keep going because we are unhappy inwardly. We cannot live with ourselves. We have to have something plugging into our ear to play music when we go for a walk. Because we can't be by ourselves. And in the old days, I mean, for even our grandfathers didn't need something plugging into their ear to go around this lake. But the younger people, the younger they get, the more is this so. We're turned outward by the fact that the conception of the human being that is taught in our educational system is one that de-emphasizes the inner being. And these religions should not give up whatever discoveries are made biologically, chemically, psychologically, or anything else. Because even psychology, fortunately now Freudian psychology is almost dead, but it began as a kind of extension of that scientific worldview into the psyche. Denying the sacred, reducing the love for God to the father complex, as was done by Freud. Can you imagine that? A person who for 5,000 years as a member of the Jewish religion had borne the burden of being witness to the oneness of God, Having written the book about the Moses complex, it's inconceivable, unbelievable. But I include even psychology. If this kind of psychology, which always starts from the outside. So religion and science must be able to respect each other for what they are, but not in the situation we have today, in which religion is always under retreat, in which the theologians are so afraid that they're usually less interested in theology than physicists. I have many physicist friends who are much more serious as theologians than many theologian friends that I have, who are trying to bend backwards to make sure that the scientists do not criticize them. From the position of inferiority complex, you can never accomplish anything. Now, having said all of this, what are the specific points in which science can help, in a sense, clarify more our understanding of the human state and of God? First of all, the grandeur of creation. The grandeur of creation. Certain great Christian writers, let's say like Albertus Magnus or St. Francis of Assisi, were very much aware of the grandeur of God's creation and its religious significance. Look how much grander it is now. Not that it is now, how much grander is our knowledge of it now. I've always given this example. For the first time a few years ago, I went to Cozumel of Mexico, and I put on one of those things on my head and looked at the incredible school of fish and the coral reefs that were underneath, which were absolutely astounding. And I wrote a poem about that later on called Creation, because I thought that here we're sitting, in a sense, what seems to be at the end of human history. We're destroying the whole earth. As suddenly a whole dimension of terrestrial beauty is revealed to us, which none of our ancestors had seen. St. Francis of Assisi, or certain Taoist sages, or Persian mystical poets had never seen such a thing. So these instruments make possible, if we have eyes and they're not blinded, to see further the grandeur of creation. Secondly, and this is something science is only now getting into itself, and that is the remarkable interrelation of all of creation. Until the environmental crisis, science had turned its back against the unity of nature. It always is interested in taking a part of nature, dividing it from everything else, segmenting it, by reduction, understanding it. Its method was essentially reductionist. And today's reductionism still remains with us. We have all now been trained to think that we are simply our DNAs. And then we read that the DNA of Palestinians and Israelis are identical. And this shows how absurd this assertion is. There must be something else involved. And we're talking about the Abrahamic initiative. Human beings must be something more than DNAs. But this reductionism has come right into our mind and soul practically. Now, gradually, science is learning. Von Weizsäcker, the great German physicist, wrote this book, The Unity of Nature, that there's an incredible unity in nature. We don't even know all of it. A bumblebee buzzing along in Ecuador could affect our lives in Maryland. We do not know all of the remarkable intricacies of nature, but now science has become aware of it. And it's a very important reminder and a support for what religions have always said of the interrelatedness of things. I've written so much on this subject, I could quote you for 10 years from my own tradition in Persian and Arabic sources, or Chinese or Indian or Christian or Jewish sources. This was part of the wisdom of the pre-modern age, of the interrelatedness of all things, and therefore that you could not disrupt things more than a certain amount. I'm totally opposed to this idea of economic determinism, according to which once you're economically forced, you'll do anything. How can a person make a statement like that? Just go for one day to Delhi. Several hundred people die every night of hunger in Delhi, but the sacred cows are walking in the streets all the time. Nobody's taking and killing the cow and say, at least for 1 month I'll have something to eat. There were people who died in the Middle Ages. They would not use certain types of trees on tops of mountains. In China, in Japan, in the West, this is totally false. There was always this idea that one cannot protrude more than a certain amount into the fabric of nature, the interlacing of things. This now, science also is affirming to a large extent, and religion can, in a sense, find a prop, a support for that. Then there's the question of what is now being discussed as intelligent design. You know, people get kicked out of universities for defending it. But there are famous microbiologists, biologists, chemists who talk about, like Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, that some of you may have read, famous biologist from Lehigh University, that life began with extreme complexity. It is not what we read in books that life goes from simplicity to complexity. The unit cell is extremely complex, so there must have been a design. And this argument from design, which has now come to the fore and caused a storm, a firestorm, in biological circles where nobody wants to talk about design. It, in a sense, is abetting what all religions have always said, namely that there is an incredible intelligence that one observes as one just looks around. I mean, that's almost impossible to deny. You have to sing a lullaby to put someone to sleep, not to see it. And how successful that lullaby has been, that we just go like zombies through life without realizing the incredible wisdom that there is in the world of nature and everything that we see around ourselves. These are points in which I think, after having said nothing and then I said something, in which science can help certain very important points with religious perspective. But the religious perspective also can do something even more important for science, which nobody wants to talk about. I'm among one of those people who believes that science, modern Western science, has now reached a dead end from the point of view of its philosophy, that there's need for a new paradigm. There are many great physicists who talk about that. That paradigm is going to come from the sacred cosmologies, the religious views of nature which have been cultivated for thousands of years. And that's why there are a certain number of very distinguished scientists, especially physicists, who are interested in Taoism and Hinduism and Islam and all of the other traditions and their views of nature. I believe what is needed is the creation of what I call very daringly sacred science again. We need the revival of a sacred science without in any way denying Western science for what it has done, but denying what it has not done, and some of its participants, and especially certain philosophers, claim that it has done. In this context, non-Western sciences can be of very great help. I happen to be myself a specialist in Islamic science. There's a science that was cultivated for some 900 years at the peak in Islamic civilization from the 8th to the 16th, 17th centuries, and which gradually declined but has not totally died out. And this science, and other sciences like it, provide a very good living example of ways of looking at the world of nature, which are logical, rational, without denying the levels of reality and the transcendent cause, without having to negate the transcendent cause in order to study the horizontal material causes. Because Christianity has forgotten this dimension of its tradition, I think the other traditions, especially Islamic science, which also influenced Western science historically so much, without which there would not have been a Newton or a Kepler, can be a very, very great help. But in order to do that, we first of all, of course, have to know, and we have to overcome our hubris. We have to overcome this idea that we have this method and it's going to solve everything for us. Modern science is a remarkable accomplishment of humanity, certain sector of humanity especially, but not others. But it's also a Faustian science in a certain way, what Goethe called the Faustian science. It's a science which brings with it very, very great dangers. And the reason for that is that it tries to study God's creation without God, including ourselves. And the end result of that will be a nihilism, a void created, which will turn order into chaos, not in the cosmic sense, but even in the social and human sense. We are at the present moment in a very, very important juncture of history. And it is interesting that from a purely religious point of view, here in America we realize how important it is for different religious voices to come together. And especially the Abrahamic Initiative, which I've supported in the very first moment that he spoke to me about it, is a very important step in this. It's important to realize that not only on the purely religious element, but even on the question of the relationship of the human being to the world, of religion to science, of how we deal with the world of nature. We are in a position in which I think accord and better understanding of other religions and other traditions can help us a great deal. There's no danger that a Persian or a Chinese or a Japanese will not be studying Western thought or Western science. But there's every great danger the other way around. The other way around. And that's what we need to do. America has been given by God tremendous power, tremendous possibilities, but also with power comes responsibility. With this comes tremendous responsibility. And perhaps here in this country, where in addition to Christianity, Judaism and Islam are major minorities, and even Hinduism, Buddhism, other religions have quite a notable presence, and all the possibilities that exist. Not only this rapprochement between religions can be made possible, but also a mutual interpenetration and enrichment of our understanding of God, of the human state, and of the world of nature, which each individual tradition has cultivated, will be made possible. Thank you.